Hello everyone, my name is Mike Kimball, and first off I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening. I know you're very busy, but hopefully at the end of this presentation you will be able to leave with some valuable knowledge on hurricane safety. So let's get started on this presentation. The first part is going to be focused on hurricanes and what you can do to need to be safe. We're going to talk about what a hurricane is, where they form, and the areas in the United States that are at the greatest risk for experiencing one of these storms. The second part of the presentation, we're going to be dealing on a case study on Hurricane Katrina and the damages that were caused in New Orleans. And finally, the main part of the presentation, we're going to get into hurricane preparedness. But first off, let's find out about hurricanes. What are these storms? Well, they're massive storms that develop over the warm ocean waters, the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean Sea. And the two main problems for hurricanes are storm surge flooding and heavy rainfall that these storms cause. Storm surge flooding is a wall of water that comes on shore and it just wipes out everything in its path. Flooding, some of these storms can produce anywhere from 8 to 10 inches of rain, especially if they stall over your area. Some locations may pick up 1 to 2 feet. That's a lot of rainfall, folks. So hurricanes, they need warm water to survive or even to form. Temperatures must be at least 80 degrees, if not warmer. And hurricane season begins on June 1st and it ends at the end of November, and you can see that corresponds to when the water temperatures are at their warmest. So development for June and July. Well, development begins in the Gulf of Mexico, the northwestern Caribbean Sea, and around the Bahamas in June and July. But as we work later into the summer months, the waters begin to warm further out in the Atlantic, and this becomes the breeding ground all the way from the Gulf of Mexico through the Caribbean Sea to the coast of Africa. Those are the areas that these storms typically form. Especially off the coast of Africa, we have these big waves coming offshore, and if they hold together, they can become a tropical depression, tropical storm, and even hurricanes. One area that meteorologists really watch is called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This is an area where the trade winds meet. You can see this red line I've drawn on this map. Where these trade winds meet, it causes the air to collide and it causes the air to rise. And as air rises, areas of low pressure form at the surface. And as these areas of low pressure form, showers and thunderstorms begin to develop. And if we see an area of showers and thunderstorms that persist over a 24-hour period, this becomes a tropical disturbance. The National Hurricane Center begins watching this area more closely. Basically what a tropical disturbance is just a disorganized area of showers and thunderstorms. For more development to occur, we have to have an area of low pressure form at the surface, and what helps that happen is the Coriolis force. In the northern hemisphere, the winds are deflected to the right. So as the storm gets better and better organized, you have an area of low pressure that begins to form, and this causes the low to spin counterclockwise. And if you have a low actually develop at the surface, we begin to have a tropical depression form. This is a satellite picture of a tropical depression in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see more showers and thunderstorms associated with it. A weak area of low pressure exposed off on the west side of it. Once again, it's beginning to rotate around the center of circulation, and these systems have winds up to 38 miles per hour sustained winds. Now, if the thing becomes a little bit better organized, we can have a tropical storm form. You can see a little bit better organization here. Most of the showers and thunderstorms still on the west side of this system. Thunderstorms are beginning to wrap around that center of circulation a little bit more. Winds increase up to 39 to 73 miles per hour sustained. And at this point, the storm earns a name. And finally, a hurricane. Hurricanes are thunderstorms rotating around the center of circulation. Winds increase to 74 miles per hour or greater, and you can see the classic eye form right in the middle of this hurricane. This is a well-developed hurricane. You can see it's very symmetric, great outflow. This is a very powerful hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. So the greatest threat from these storms are where you see these little red shaded dots. Anywhere along the outer banks of North Carolina to around Charleston, that's a prime breeding ground for landfalling hurricanes. Anywhere around the southern tip of Florida from, let's say, Vero Beach, Miami, Key West, on up toward Fort Myers. And then a third area right around the New Orleans area in southeastern Louisiana. Those are the primary areas that can experience a direct hit from a hurricane, although anywhere from Maine all the way around to the Texas coastline is at risk. So let's talk about the damages from these storms. Massive storms. Remember, winds are sustained at least 75 miles per hour or greater. Some of these stronger storms have winds well over 150 to 200 miles per hour. They're very rare, but they do occur. So the main threat from a hurricane is the storm surge. This poses the greatest risk to life and property. Remember, that's that wall of water that comes on shore and it washes everything away. Buildings, trees, whatever's in the way will get wiped out. Responsible for most of the deaths inside a hurricane, and the storm surge can be as high as 25 to 30 feet high. Remember back in 1969 with Hurricane Camille, back in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, we had a storm surge near the Pass Christian, Bay St. Louis, Mississippi area of 28 feet. So you can imagine the devastation that was caused by these storms. So what affects the storm surge? Well, there are several factors that go in to affect the height of this wave. One is the storm motion. The faster the storm moves, the greater that storm surge can get. The pressure, the lower the pressure, the air begins to rise, and it also sucks up some of that water from the ocean. It sucks it up a little bit higher. Also wind speed and the slope of the coastline. All of those ingredients come together to affect the storm surge. Now here's some pictures of a storm surge. This was taken in Fort Walton Beach on September 16, 2004 as Hurricane Ivan was making landfall. This was a Category 3. You can see this police cruiser well away from the Gulf of Mexico. But look at that water knocking at his door. I tell you what, I would not like to be in this police cruiser right now. Remember, that was 1 mile inland from the Gulf of Mexico. Here's some pictures of other damage from storm surge. This is along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Houses, apartment complexes completely destroyed. Trees completely uprooted. Nothing can survive a storm surge. And that's why it's very important that you listen to local emergency managers for evacuations. They will evacuate low-lying areas and areas that are prone to seeing a massive storm surge. Storm surge threats. The greatest threat for storm surge is in New York City, followed by Miami, Virginia Beach, and New Orleans. Those areas are most likely going to experience a very, very high storm surge when these storms come through. Remember those factors that affected it. And basically, this is caused by the shape of the coastline that allows that water to pile up even more as that water moves on shore. Now, another threat from hurricanes are tornadoes. This is a picture of a tornado that was taken in Virginia caused by Hurricane Ivan back in 2004. Now remember, we just talked about Ivan. It made landfall in the Florida Panhandle. This storm is still producing damage in Virginia. You can see on the next slide the damage that this tornado caused in portions of Virginia. Once again, houses completely destroyed, trees uprooted. So remember, hurricanes affect a wide swath of area. Remember, landfall was in Florida, causing damage in Virginia, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. The next threat, wind damage. And this causes a lot of trees to come down, power lines to come down, and that results in electricity loss. Many people, millions and millions of people may be affected with power outages because you have to remember when hurricanes have winds of 74 miles per hour or greater, and that causes winds and trees and everything else in its path to be blown around, and once again, these strong winds can occur well inland. So let's go a little bit farther into this presentation and look at some of these dramatic pictures. The picture on the left is Hurricane Katrina affecting the Canal Street in downtown New Orleans. You can see those palm trees bending almost to the vertical, and a lot of the street signs blowing around and power lines down. So wind damage is another major threat from hurricanes. And finally, flooding. Believe it or not, some of these storms can produce anywhere from 8 to 10 inches of rain. However, if they slow down, which they typically do, you can have 1 to 2 feet of rainfall possible. This is a picture taken in Albany, Georgia in 1994 from Tropical Storm Alberto. Alberto made landfall in Florida. It stalled over Georgia and dumped nearly 2 feet of rain in portions of southwestern Georgia. So flooding is also a primary concern from these hurricanes. Now, we're going to talk about Hurricane Katrina. We're going to look at firsthand some of the damages that these massive hurricanes can cause. Katrina, 24 hours before landfall, this is the satellite picture of the storm. You can see the bright white clouds, indicative of very tall cloud tops. Very heavy thunderstorms in this area, wrapping around that big eye. Peak winds at this point were 175 miles per hour with gusts to well over 200. This storm caused nearly 2,000 deaths, completely flooded the city of New Orleans, and devastated the Louisiana and Mississippi Gulf Coast. Once again, devastation was widespread. The National Hurricane Center ranks hurricanes on a scale of 1 to 5, a 1 being the weakest, a 5 being the strongest. Once you get into Category 3 with winds over 111 miles per hour or greater, we can begin to classify those as major hurricanes. These storms are responsible for most deaths and most storm surge. So if you have a Category 3, 4, or 5 storm coming your way, you really need to take that storm seriously and begin to evacuate and do whatever local emergency managers say. So New Orleans is a very vulnerable city. In fact, it's one of the most vulnerable cities in the United States because it is surrounded by water. Here is New Orleans. To the north, you have Lake Pontchartrain. To the south and to the east, you have the Gulf of Mexico. Compounding the problem is it sits below sea level. So as that water is being protected because they have an extensive levee system surrounding the city of New Orleans. Here's another map of New Orleans. Up here is Lake Pontchartrain, this little white shaded area. Down to the south, this winding line is the Mississippi River. And between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River sits the city of New Orleans. Unfortunately, it's kind of like in a bowl shape with the highest elevations being along the Mississippi River and right along the lakefront. Remember, New Orleans is protected by an extensive levee system, and here's a picture of all the levees that are protecting the city of New Orleans. Now, some of these levees are 10 to 15 feet high, so in some parts of New Orleans, you can look up to the lake. That's kind of a scary sight, especially if you have a major hurricane coming your way. Inside the levee walls are numerous pumping stations which pump water out of the city back into the lake. Remember, hurricanes cause a lot of rainfall, and these pumping stations are responsible for pumping that water out of the city. However, if the levees break, as they did in Katrina back in 2005, these pumping stations get flooded out, and all that water from Lake Pontchartrain rushes into the city, and you have severe flooding. And that's exactly what happened back in 2005. New Orleans, 80% flooded, and it stranded thousands and thousands of people. New Orleans is a very vulnerable city, and the Red Cross does not have any designated evacuation centers in the city of New Orleans, primarily because it is below sea level. But what the city of New Orleans did prior to Hurricane Katrina making landfall was designate two sites of last resort. One of these was the Louisiana Superdome. About 20 to 30,000 people stranded here. You can see all these people outside after Hurricane Katrina left. And the second area was the New Orleans Convention Center. Thousands of people stranded there as well. You have to remember, this is after the storm passed, no electricity, no running water. Life was very miserable for these people. And you can see the results of some of that flooding. This house almost completely inundated. Rescue people, saving people from the roofs of homes. This was a common sight throughout the city of New Orleans. So now you can see the devastation that these hurricanes can cause. Let's do a recap on Katrina. Nearly 2,000 people were killed from this storm. Nearly 25,000 people rescued in the following days after Hurricane Katrina. It took nearly 1 month to get the city completely dry. It had to take a while to get those pumping stations back online and to pump that water out. And finally, 10 years later, New Orleans is still rebuilding. So right now we're going to take a little break. I hope you enjoyed this first part of the presentation, but when we come back, we're going to be really talking about what you can do to prepare for these storms. I'll see you in about 10 minutes.